we're absolutely delighted that Jenni and Stephen are with us today. It's great to have you both give up your time and join us here. It's a very, we'd call it dreich day. It's raining where I am currently in Scotland, and we appreciate you giving up your time and coming along today, and also to all our participants for coming along. We know how busy things are at the moment, and we're grateful for everybody giving up the time. As Annette said, we're here to mostly kind of focus on this book, and I'm going to show off because I've got more post-its on my book than Annette did. This book is a great read, and it's not just about being a great read, but it's about the accessibility and the kind of sense that it talks about in terms of that quality implementation, and spending a bit of time talking about actually why do so many kind of quality implementation or change initiatives fail, and actually what needs to happen to make sure that actually it's not just change but improvement, and that it's quality and it's implemented successfully. So we're delighted that you're here with us today, and as Annette said, really keen for everybody to get involved in the conversation. So I suppose maybe as a starter, I know you have slides to share, Jenni and Stephen, maybe a little bit just about a background about where the book kind of came from and how it started, and then for you maybe to share some what would be key for you for the colleagues on the call to know.
Excellent. Should I go ahead then and share my screen? And I think Stephen will get us started. I have to just figure out, I think, share a particular window. I'm going to have to just figure this out. Sorry, I'm not so used to using Teams, so I think I have to do this first. Just bear with me for a second. That's what I'm looking for. I've got it. Okay. There we go. So Stephen, once I go full screen, I lose my view of everyone. So I'm going to count on you to kind of lead me through the slides when you'd like me to go ahead and advance. And I could talk briefly about how the idea came out if you'd like me to start.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so I actually approached Stephen. I've been watching Stephen's work for many, many years and have loved all of his writing and thinking. And we brought him into the district where I worked in Ontario many times, and just so rewarding to work with him, and was really interested in writing with him. And we sat down and started talking about where our work intersects. And eventually, after a few planning meetings and a lot of brainstorming, we landed on the idea that this is really about quality implementation and how to reach what quality implementation means, how to reach it, the role of collective efficacy, and that's how this conceptual framework that you talked about came to be. So I think in our time together, we'll work through all of those ideas. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Stephen, for these first few slides.
Great, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. I've been on this call for over 12 minutes now, and people have said more nice things about me than I think in the last year. So I joked earlier in the pre-call that as a psychologist, I really do understand the tactic of flattery will get you everywhere, but I'm still succumbing to it, and so I appreciate it, and please keep doing it some more. So basically, as Jenni mentioned, I've been involved in system work for a very long time, and I've been trying to understand organizational development and improvement, and how we actually bridge the gap between our best efforts at the system level and watching things really land on student desks. And if it doesn't make it to the student desk, it really doesn't have an impact. And we noticed a really, really big gap between some extremely good intentions, both in terms of people's will and in terms of the investment we made in developing the public knowledge base around really good evidence-based, evidence-informed practices that ultimately just didn't stick, or if they did stick, they stuck temporarily. And 2, 3, 4 years later, you would be hard-pressed to find any evidence of them ever having been there at all. And this is sort of something that would be familiar to most of you in your particular roles and spaces. And we talk about being in perpetual launch mode. We make huge investments in the front end. We launch all kinds of things with great intentions. And then ultimately, we experience a gap between the promise and the ultimate long-standing and sustained impact. So Jenny, if you could just flip the slide, please. There's a lot of work that's been done in the healthcare space around this whole concept of why is it just so difficult when we really know something and have good science and good evidence to suggest it makes excellent sense? Why does that not land for us? And we've learned things like how unbelievably difficult it is to interrupt the status quo because of a whole range of what we call cognitive biases that tend to confirm and affirm what we already think, believe, know, and do. People will talk about things like saying, well, you know, this isn't really what I was trained for. It's not within my particular purview. I don't have the time to get involved in this. I didn't even really know that there was evidence behind it. Or even philosophically, this just doesn't make sense to me. And as you can see in the slide, we can completely replace healthcare with education, and all of the same core findings hold. Thanks, Jenny, if you can flip. So we really do experience this sort of chasm between really good, well-intentioned ideas and the concept of what we would call, you know, high-quality implementation. And so we engage with the evidence base, which is often labeled as what works. And we really find that it's not really what works, it's what's supposed to work. It's supposed to work somewhere for someone, but if you can't make it work for you in your space, in your context, it really doesn't offer you very much. And so as we worked a lot with different districts and authorities all over the place, we realized that context isn't just noise. It's not, let's just figure out how to filter out the context so that we can do what best practice and best evidence suggests is a good idea. We actually have to understand context as an absolutely essential component of quality implementation. In other words, we can know a lot about early reading and good comprehensive literacy, but if you can't make that work in your school with your kids and your teachers, it's really not worth knowing. So we have to get these things to deliver on their promises. And, you know, most of my work, to be honest with you, lately, as I've worked more and more on quality implementation, has turned me a little bit more into an anthropologist than a psychologist, because I find myself getting embedded in districts in very long-standing relationships, recognizing how much context either makes or breaks the implementation work. It's about who the people are, how they think, what they believe, structures, power, politics, all of those organizational dynamics that make a big difference. And of course, the biggest piece of context that is a reality for all of us right now is the pandemic. Right now, you know, we are in places where people are saying, I have a really good understanding of comprehensive literacy in the early years, but I don't know how to implement that in a virtual environment, in a pandemic context with kids who I don't see each and every day. So unless we can actually say, how do you learn your way through making this work in context, we really fail to mobilize the knowledge. And as I've worked more and more with leaders looking at implementation, I would always hear things like, I think this makes great sense, but. And then the but would be followed by a bunch of if statements. If I had a stable teaching staff, if the teaching staff was trained, if I didn't have such a transient community, if I didn't have so many kids with complex special needs. And one of the things that, you know, I always say to the leaders that I coach is that the ifs are the work. All those if, you know, most leaders want to focus on the then and try to figure out how to get, you know, how to just bypass the ifs, but the ifs are the work. You know, it isn't leadership if you don't know how to actually tackle the ifs to be able to get to the then. Jenny, if you could flip for me, please, thanks. So the bottom line is, when we now take this concept of implementing with quality in context, to the point Jenny made earlier, the commitment to being willing to work this through in your space, not to say, well, this doesn't work for me because you didn't account for my context, but to rather say, how do I learn my way through this in my context so that I can make it work for us, absolutely relies on a set of core beliefs of both administrators, and Jenny, if you'll just push one more time, and of teachers. If administrators and teachers don't believe that they have the skills and capacities to actually make this work for them in their space, in their context, in other words, work through the if statements, then all of it doesn't land even close to what's promised by our best evidence and practice. And Jenny, if you could push it one more time. So when we talk about quality implementation is a process. It is a process, a collective commitment amongst a group of people who are saying, I know this is supposed to work. We need to make this work for us. We have to apply and experiment with it. We have to assess impact relative to the intended outcomes. We have to look at what worked and didn't work within our respective context. And one more push, and then we have to make the necessary modifications accordingly. So we don't expect that the change initiative lands as an algorithm. We expect that the change initiative lands with solid evidence behind it, but it's for us to implement a learning process, a professional learning process that will ultimately help us allow the promise of that to be realized in practice. So I think what we're doing now is we pause and give people an opportunity to think and comment, and we can discuss a little bit before Jenny takes us into sort of our next piece, which is, so how do we in fact tap into those core beliefs?
Thanks, Stephen. Absolutely. So if anyone has any comments to come in, and just that last bit you were talking about there, Stephen, obviously comes through in the book about schools being a learning environment, not just for students, but for teachers as well. And, you know, Jenny, you referenced that in the book as well about a comment that was made about it's about for students, but actually it is a learning environment and it should be for everybody. So are there any kind of comments or questions anyone want to come in and ask anything around that? Because that was a great introduction from Stephen about that kind of background and basis of quality implementation. And I suppose it's deliberately about quality implementation and not about change initiative. And I think that comment that you made, Stephen, at the start about in perpetual kind of launch mode, I think probably resonates with a lot of people on the call about the general feeling about its constant introduction of a new initiative, but actually how often do we see those initiatives really stick? So John Robertson, would you like to come in, John? Unmute and come in.
Hi there. I quite like the idea of working through the ifs. That was what leadership was all about. That's what you said. I'm just wondering if you can give us a good example, like a worked example. I'm a maths teacher. I like a nice, clear example that I can follow.
Absolutely. So for like one particular example that we see a fair bit often has to do with the particular deployment of human resource, right? So one of the things that we find, leaders will often tell us all the time, you know, this makes really good sense, but my school is a really, really busy place. I don't have the opportunity as an administrator or a lead learner to practice the kind of instructional leadership of getting into classrooms. So one of the things that we know from the research, for example, is that classroom visits are a really important instructional leadership practice for administrators if you do them right. So if what you do as an administrator is, in terms of monitoring the instructional program, is you pop your head into a classroom at random, you stand against the back wall, you fold your arms, and then you leave and you never say anything, it's better you don't even show up at all, because all that's going to do is actually unsettle people. What you need to do if you're looking to do something like quality classroom visits or observations as an administrator is something that feels a little bit more like a continuous coaching conversation. So you go to classrooms with purpose, you have particular foci that you keep your eye on. You've had a conversation with the classroom teacher earlier about what particular piece of professional practice the individual is working on. You make some observations around that, and later on you engage the individual with it in a debrief, and then you follow through with that. We often will have places where people will say things to us like, there is no way we can get to that. That's a great practice in theory, and I'm glad you can give me an article that tells me how I should do it, but that doesn't work in my context, right? And so the learning process that then unfolds, which connects to the concept of quality implementation, is something that we refer to as strategic execution. And strategic execution is, how do you rescue space from what we call the whirlwind of daily life to be able to do the important work? And so some schools will say things like, I just can't get to the important stuff because the whirlwind never dies down. There is always so much stuff happening and I'm in reactive mode all the time. But I can find you, for every one of those schools, I can find you another school with an equally whirling whirlwind, where the understanding is that if I don't actually take out my calendar and schedule my classroom visits and put in place some strategies where if something goes wrong and I'm doing my classroom visits, there's person 1, 2, and 3 who you go to before you call me on the walkie-talkie. And those people are able to do that. They get into the classrooms, they're able to engage in the observations and the conversations, not because they waited for the whirlwind to die down, but because they put a strategy in place to rescue space from the whirlwind. So that would be like kind of one leadership example that I just saw recently around this.
I could share an example too. As you were sharing, Stephen, I was thinking of working with a math PLC, professional learning community, a few years ago in a large high school. And when we think about tackling those ifs, one of their ifs was that students would show better progress in achievement if they showed up to class more often. And as we worked through a progressive inquiry where, and I don't remember what the unit was, but it was a large high school and 3 math teachers were all teaching the same unit at the same time. It was one of the essential understandings from the curriculum. And at the end, during one of the collaborative meetings, they were looking at the progress and achievement for each one of their students, and they realized that one teacher had made better gains with the students than a couple others, and they started to share what strategies being used. But the conversation kept coming to the if students would show up and engage more, I could get better results. But what interrupted that thinking was when the teachers looked at and laid over the student attendance data, they realized that that if is something they had to dismiss because they realized that students who had been in class weren't making the same progress that some who hadn't shown up very often. So it's that notion of working through those progressive inquiries where that we're testing our hypothesis and then looking at the evidence to confirm or disprove that information. And I hope that helps as well.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you, Stephen. And you referenced that in the book as well about PLCs, about having the PLCs being open as well to that disproving and that kind of the bias that might be brought into that, which is really important. So I think that's a really important aspect of the PLC about not just a talking shop, but actually about looking at actions and really exploring that in depth about what does this actually tell us, which you referenced in the book as well. I'm just going to wonder if Fiona Welsh would like to come in. Fiona's got a question about additional support needs and introducing that concept. Fiona, would you like to come in?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Fiona, we can, yep.
So I'm looking to develop the leadership within the school, and I've shared the concept of collective teacher efficacy with the staff, and I'm about to sort of measure their sense of their own efficacy at the minute, either self-efficacy or collective teacher efficacy. However, interestingly, we're talking about the context, and a lot of the things that I've read, it was quite often mainstream schools or secondary schools. However, I'm looking for, you know, a signpost really to any research of the effect of collective teacher efficacy within an ASN sector which has a wide range of children, some with complex needs. I suppose, like Hattie would state, the effect would be 1.57, but it's quite difficult to measure the effect in a different setting. So I'm kind of looking to, I could work it, you know, we will going forward, we will sort of work it out within ourselves, but I would like to know if within a similar context research has been done.
I didn't catch the context. Did you talk about the context is with students with special education needs? I'm sorry, I just missed that important part about your specific context.
Yes, quite a wide range of special educational needs.
Okay. So although Professor Hattie has done the meta-analysis, or he has synthesized the meta-analyses, it's Rachel Ells, who was a professor out of the University of Chicago, who conducted the meta-analysis that Hattie used to rank collective teacher efficacy. Since then, there's been a second meta-analysis done. And I know that those individual studies, you'd have to take a look at those in particular to determine which ones might apply to a context similar to yours. I know that Roger Goddard, who is out of Ohio State University, has done some numerous studies that look at different contexts. He would be the person that I would direct you to that might have some specific individual studies looking at, you know, primary, elementary, and high school age students with special education needs. Roger Goddard.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. And Stefan put a question about what do you see to be the unique challenges to the education system? And that's going to reference to National Health Service that Stefan's been involved in, the Scottish Coaching Leadership Improvement Programme, which is run by our National Health Service. So I suppose that's linking back to that initial point, Stephen, about the similarities. But are there any kind of unique challenges, do you think, to the education system compared to the health system?
It's a difficult one for me to answer because, I mean, I think that, you know, we have some fairly significant similarities in our contexts. The bottom line from my perspective is, you know, within our education context, and I would draw a parallel with our health context, we are really, really structurally determined. And by that, I would argue, like, as somebody who's interested in organizational learning and development, I'm a firm believer that structure needs to follow function, not the other way around. So in other words, we have to have a clear understanding of function and purpose, and then we need to be able to mobilize structures to support those functions. One of the things that we see in our education and in our healthcare spaces, but particularly education, it's almost worse, is that our structures are built for life. And it's the combination of, you know, large public bureaucracies with, you know, the combination of union, public, you know, government, just all of the kind of challenges, I guess, that kind of come together around making an environment extremely rigid and not particularly nimble. So what it often means is we will find in districts that there are all kinds of structures, and by structures I mean, you know, roles, meetings, teams, committees that were well intentioned at some point, but have become quite detached from the function. And they are what we call activity traps, meaning they keep people very, very busy, but the work is not truly fit for purpose. So structure isn't following function. Instead of what's happening is structure is pushing function. So we really learned this in the context of the pandemic, right? Because the pandemic really asked for nimble and change and words like pivot and flexible and adaptive. And our large school districts are none of those things, right? We can't move quickly enough. We can't blow up structures and reconstitute structures to do things that we need to do quickly. And we've really, really seen that as a challenge for us in our particular space. Sometimes I do, and I have to say, this is something that's often felt by individuals within the organizations themselves. So like school principals will say to me all the time, I'm pulled out for all of these different meetings, and honestly, it doesn't seem like there's any real coherence behind them. And that's something that really is defined as a core challenge, because to be quite honest, it really pisses them off, because they're out of their buildings. It doesn't feel like it's value added, because these things have been in place for a long time. And I often say there's nothing worse than a meeting in search of an agenda. The number of times it's like the meeting's coming up, who send agenda items. Well, why are we having the meeting if we don't know what the agenda items are, So being completely structurally determined is something that really, really makes it difficult for us to respect that structure follows function notion.
Thank you, Stephen. And I suppose you referenced the pandemic. There is an opportunity within this. How do you see that what needs to happen to move that forward?
Well, I mean, I have to say, it's hard to find a silver lining in the pandemic, but I will say from a change management perspective, the urgency that the pandemic has created by virtue of necessity has done things within the course of 1 year that would have probably taken us 10 years. Even things as simple but complicated as getting people into a virtual environment and into 21st century skills in a way that would have taken 10 years of negotiations and conversations and back and forths and, appeals for money and all kinds of things. So we've worked very, very quickly to solve some of the technical challenges. We aren't really in a place, to be honest with you. It's only now in my context that I'm seeing people turn the corner, and now they're saying, okay, we have to figure out how to do school improvement in this space. Up until now, we were figuring out on how to survive. So it was, do we have enough Chromebooks, and are people online, and do they have internet connections, and have we lost any kids? But people weren't really saying, who isn't reading and who am I worried about, right? But the pandemic, is a giant, in my opinion, it's an amplifier or a catalyst of everything. So in places where there was weakness before, a crack is now a chasm, right? Our students who we were worried about before, we're more worried about them now, right? If you were a struggling reader before, you're struggling more as a reader now, if we even know that you're still struggling, because we haven't lost you. So those are the kinds of things that we're concerned with in this space. And it's a capital A adaptive challenge, because we have to learn our way through it, because we've never been here before.
Yeah.
And I think too, when we come back to the notion of collective efficacy and think about being in this space, we know that there are 4 sources that inform individuals and teams' beliefs about what they're capable of accomplishing. And it was Stephen that pointed out to me, like, one of those 4 sources is feelings and emotions, the physiological reactions when we're faced with challenges. And the research shows that negative affective states, which become those enemies of efficacy, things like anxiety and stress and fear, the research shows that they become elevated during the time of a pandemic. So, we think that even that's something that would place our efficacy at risk. We also know that efficacy beliefs are situational specific and weighed in relation to the person or team's perception about the difficulty or magnitude of the challenge. And so I think that, knowing that we perceive this as a large challenge in our lives, that could also put efficacy at risk, at further risk.
I'll just jump in for a second and sort of tell you, it's really interesting from a psychological perspective about what we know about a negative emotion like fear, right? So one of the things that I share with people is what I call the sort of like 3 legs of the fear stool, right? And the 3 legs of the fear stool are, that we're in an environment that we don't feel like we have a lot of control over, number 1. Number 2, we don't really have the evidence we need to tell us what we're supposed to do. And the third thing is that we don't have a sense of a timeline that would suggest, when this will be over. you put all those three things together and you really have the trifecta for a fear-based response. And one of the things we know in a changed environment, and this connects to collective efficacy in the way Jenni shared, is that the emotions are trumping the cognitions all the time, right? Emotions are, take what we call a low road of transfer. So you feel an emotion before your prefrontal cortex has even had a chance to rationalize and try to think your way out of something. And so we find ourselves, in an environment that is very emotionally laden and emotionally heavy within this particular space, for the same kinds of reasons that I shared before and that Jenni alluded to earlier.
Yeah.
But I will say one other thing, because I don't want to leave you with this doom and gloom thing, because people often will say, how important hope is. And what I wanted to say to you about hope is that, I got interested in looking at what the research on hope suggests. And, some people misunderstand hope and they believe hope is blind optimism. But actually, if you look at the evidence base, hope as a predictor of positive outcomes isn't blind optimism. It's defined as pragmatic agency, meaning that you make hope. You don't just have hope, you make hope. And so part of what we talk about in the context of collective efficacy, right, that mobilizes a sense of agency to learn your way through things, that's making hope. And we're seeing examples of that around us all the time in this context.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And I suppose that leads us on to the next part of this. Jenni, if you'd like to maybe talk us through some of those actions or the elements of the book that you've kind of highlighted that really make quality implementation work. So that, because it's now 2:10, so maybe we move on to that section and have a kind of discussion and open up that up for discussion as well. So we can maybe share some of the content and then see if there's any kind of questions about that from participants.
Sure. So I think where I'm going to go to now, just very briefly, because I started to talk about this, and I'll just very briefly talk about what are the sources of efficacy. And the research, and this goes back to Albert Bandura, educational psychologist at Stanford University, who coined the term, identified 4 sources, the number 1 being when we experience success, and we interpret that success through a growth mindset. So we understand that it was our efforts that helped contribute to student progress and achievement. And we start to believe that if we tried again, we'd likely succeed. We build our confidence, and it's the most potent source of efficacy shaping information because it's based on a firsthand experience. Second source is vicarious experiences. When we see others who are faced with similar challenges and or opportunities meet with success, we start to believe, well, if they did it, then surely we can do it too. Social persuasion, when teams are convinced by a credible and trustworthy other that they constitute an effective group, they're more likely to take risks. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, that 4th source, those negative affective states becoming diminishers of efficacy, and those positive affective states and feelings becoming a way to enhance our efficacy. And again, just briefly, what I said is when we're forming our beliefs, so collective efficacy beliefs are future-oriented beliefs about what we believe we're capable of accomplishing. And we, as we're processing our beliefs about what we're capable of doing in a cognitive way, we draw on those 4 sources that I just shared, experiences, and we weigh them in relation to our perception about how difficult is the task. How difficult is what we're being asked to do. And so in the book, what we do is we, the second part of the book just goes into how might you create mastery experiences? What are some ways that teams can engage together to realize mastery? What are some ways to create those vicarious experiences, and what's important in relation to having that observation or model in relation to building a team's efficacy? And then we tackle the social persuasion and affective states in the final chapter. But what we also do is, and this comes back to that conceptual framework that Annette mentioned, we're really looking at, and Stephen mentioned this earlier, a professional learning process. It boils down to engaging people when they have time to collaborate in a structure that's going to get them to shift their attributions for student success away from things that are external, like the home students come from, toward things that are within the team's control. That progressive inquiry takes care of those things that we know from implementation science in the healthcare system. It helps us to figure out how to make those evidence-based practices work in our context, given our unique circumstances and our student population. And so, what we really do is walk through a lot of examples in the field that Stephen and I have been part of, because this has been our work. And I hope that the examples resonate with people, because they're based on stories from teams that we've engaged with. And then we look at, too, throughout, is what are the positive consequences that occur when teams realize collective impact. When they engage in progressive inquiry, they realize the collective impact, they interpret success through that growth mindset, and as a result, they start to set more challenging goals. That, like I said earlier, attributions for success and failure start to become internalized. They increase positive interdependence and are more likely to buy into and want to engage in collaborations because they see the value in it, and a host of all other, things, including an increase in efficacy and an increase in student achievement as a result. So I did a lot of talking there. I'll just kind of stop. I think I did a lot of waving of my hands too.
That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And you covered a huge amount there, which is, but it's fascinating. And I suppose we'll see if there's any questions from any participants. But what you're describing is that kind of cultural piece as well, or is that kind of a culture of learning, a culture of and Stephen, you referred, we talked to you about the video about imposter syndrome, but that is critical in terms of permission to not know is permission to learn, and the kind of openness of not blaming but learning together, which is crucial for that. What would you say would be the kind of a starting point for a school leader who maybe has come into a new context, getting a sense of where things are and it's not quite where they want it to be? Where would you advise them to start with that?
So, for me, and I'll just kind of connect into what you said about culture. So one of the things that we know from the organizational change and the change management literature is, and it's cliche, but it's culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? That's the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But the only way you change culture is through strategy, right? So it's a little bit of a vicious cycle. So the question then becomes, what does it actually look like to start to try to influence that? And one of the things that we found is it really is about the leader being extremely explicit and overt in being willing to lean in and become the core protagonist in the learning journey. So in other words, don't be the lead knower, be the lead learner. Show the staff or the individuals who you hope to influence. That's the definition of leadership that I like to use. Leadership is influence, right? Influence of others in relation to certain things. Leaders need followers. And from that perspective, what we want to see are leaders who are leaning in, who are modeling what it means to be a lead learner, who are willing to say, I don't know, visibly and publicly in front of their staffs, and who are able to actually model what the learning or the progressive inquiry process will look like, because it gives other people in the building to say, permission, I don't know. Because the thing about the imposter syndrome that makes it really insidious, and by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, the imposter syndrome basically refers to the notion that it's that little voice inside of you that says, I don't know how you got to be here, but you're kind of like one stupid comment away from being found out as a fraud, or maybe a hiring mistake. So you keep your mouth shut. And the thing about the imposter syndrome that makes it so insidious is it makes you believe that you're the only one and that everybody around you is super competent. But of course, they're all thinking the same thing, like maybe I'm the one who doesn't know what I'm doing. And so the way you interrupt and we talk about this in Intentional Interruption, one of the other books we've done, one of the ways you interrupt the imposter syndrome is you actually make it extremely clear that it's a property of everybody, not just one or two individuals. And the way you open that up is by having the leader, the formal leader, go first.
Thanks, Stephen. Are there any questions, any comments or questions anyone would like to come in? It's about approaching 20 past 2. The time is just flying by. I can't believe how quickly the time's going. Are there any kind of queries, comments, questions you'd like to come in? There's an opportunity now. We've got Jenny and Stephen here to answer anything, so please kind of come in if you've got anything.
David, while you're waiting for other folks to decide if they're going to come in, I was just wondering if Jenny and Stephen would maybe talk a wee bit about why implementations often fail and what the role of collective efficacy is around failed implementations, so that we can start to think about how we head some of that off at the pass.
I've got some slides for that. If I could just pull them up. I've lost that window, but just oh, there it is. Okay. Just very briefly in our book, let me try and share this window. This happens in the early part of the book. Here we go. Window. And we share examples. I don't know if I really have a lot of time to share out all the examples, but we really boil it down to 3 reasons how collective efficacy impacts quality implementation. So 3 ways in which that happens is, number 1, collective efficacy impacts how teams perceive constraints or opportunities. When efficacy is lacking, teams believe that their efforts are not going to amount to much, so they typically don't put forth a whole lot of effort. But where efficacy is present, teams figure out ways to exercise control despite the challenges that they're faced with. And in our book, we share stories about how these come to fruition in different school environments. The second way, collective efficacy, again, if it's diminished, it's going to impact quality implementation because teams reduce the goals they set. And when teams reduce goals, it impacts their motivation. But where efficacy is present, teams show greater motivational investment, and that's activated through goal setting. So we go into the research around why goal setting is important and how it works. In education, we've been asked to set goals, multiple layers. Teachers set goals. We ask teachers to set goals with their students. We ask school leaders to set goals with their school improvement teams. But I don't think we know enough about why goal setting is important and how it works to motivate people. We paint out the difference between mastery goals and performance goals. And we get into some of the research behind goal setting, and it is a key element, I think, here. One of the interesting studies that we looked at when we talk about how efficacy impacts motivational investments, this was a masked experiment, masked because the participants didn't know they were taking place in a research study. They thought they were joining a cycling competition, and they were randomly assigned to groups of 3, and then randomly assigned 13 of those triads were put in a high efficacy treatment group, and 13 of those triads were randomly assigned to a low efficacy treatment group. The teams were given the task of going a certain distance on a stationary bike together in the fastest time possible, and they were asked to set both a time finishing place goal. So how long do you think it'll take your team to complete this distance? And where do you think you'll place out of all the teams involved? And then between the time trials, the different groups were given bogus feedback. Those in the high efficacy group were told, you're in the top 5%, your chances of winning are really great. And those in the low efficacy group were told, you're in the bottom 20%, you probably won't have a chance to recover. Then they were asked to reset a time goal and a finishing place goal. And I often ask people to predict, what do you think happened with those 2 different treatment groups? Those in the low efficacy group, with that bogus feedback, that became a diminisher of their efficacy, and as a result, they lowered their goals. But what's worse is not only did they set lower goals, they also decrease their efforts, because with each time in between those time trials, given that bogus feedback that was efficacy diminishing, you're in the bottom 20%, they lowered their goals and also slackened their efforts. And the third way is that efficacy beliefs impact expectations. You know, when efficacy is lacking, we tend to have lower expectations that become self-fulfilling prophecies. And if it's present, we tend to have higher expectations, again, which become self-fulfilling prophecies. That was a lot packed in, and I realize we've got 6 minutes left, so maybe I went a little too far with all of that, but I'll pause and just come back to the larger group.
Thanks, Jenny. It is fascinating within the book. Another example about the insurance company and the teams that are set up, and how that links back to setting in schools for ability setting. There's so many questions around that. I think that the book points in directions of things that I think when people read that, it will ask questions about actually, well, what we're trying to achieve with that, and is that actually going to result in improved outcomes? So, I mean, there's a lot within that, and the stories that permeate through the book are obviously in there deliberately and demonstrate and grab the reader to understand actually that in action, and why does that work or why that doesn't work. I suppose just before we finish up, one question from me, and I don't know if there's any other questions going to come in from anyone, but it's about timescales, I suppose. And I know we've only got 5 minutes, so I'm putting in a short timescale for the answer to the question. But we do still tend to work in Scottish schools. That sounded very Scottish schools, August to June timescales for improvement and change process. What's your experience, or what would your advice be about timescales for quality implementation in schools?
So, I mean, I can just jump in on this one, and I can tell you that one of the things that's really been a really huge impediment for us is actually thinking about the context of school improvement goal setting and planning as an annual event. All that is done is fed into it becoming a giant structure-bound activity trap. People don't talk about school improvement as a function. They actually think about it as a structure that's defined by templates and tools and binders and reports and all of those kinds of things. They don't think about continuous learning and improvement as a mindset, right? And the organizational change literature says that we are much better to invest in a model of continuous learning and improvement that asks us to have the two things that I consider to be sacred: rhythm and discipline, right? Rhythm and discipline. In other words, you need a cadence or a rhythm. It's like getting good at anything. You want to be good at a musical instrument. You don't practice once a month for 5 hours. You practice, multiple times a week in short increments. And it's not any different than this, which is that when your school improvement work is built into the fabric of what you do in a rhythmic and disciplined way as a routine, what we call a habit of practice, a settled tendency, a habit of practice, you are much more likely to be successful, because what you do is you work small and you work tight. And there's a very strong body of literature in psychology called the psychology of small wins. And the psychology of small wins tells us that small wins aren't small. They're actually disproportionate to the challenge, because they convince you that bigger things are achievable. So it's just kind of success breeds success kind of thing. And so what you want to do is, it's back to the right inch kind of concept. You don't want to be working in these massive, giant kind of cycles. In fact, in strategic execution, research tells us that if you have 1 to 2 small goals, you'll accomplish them. If you have 3 to 5 goals, you'll probably only accomplish 1. And if you've got more than 5 goals, you'll accomplish 0 of them. So small, frequent, rhythmic, disciplined, all the kind of stuff that we know from exercise and diet and getting good at the piano and all of those kinds of things, same methodology.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Okay. So thank you so much, everybody. We are almost right on the 14:30 button, but we cannot possibly stop without thanking Jenni and Stephen for joining us today, and thanking all of you for coming along and taking part in this conversation. I hope you found it as beneficial as I have. Stephen, I've written down several phrases that I will carry me as the new Katzisms in my working days. The ifs of the work, activity traps. I think we get stuck in them in our team sometimes too. 3 legs of the fear stool, really powerful one. We make hope. And for us at this time, how powerful is that notion of pragmatic agency? And the last one I loved, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So thank you so much for taking part in this conversation today. Jenni, as always, it's such a joy to have you with us and have that really robust, deep, rich learning. So I'm sure everybody would like to join with me, and thank you so much for giving so freely of your time. I can see from the chat, people have really enjoyed it. Books are being sold. Amazon's doing a great deal, I think, as we go along. So thank you so very much. We've really appreciated it. The recording will go online as quickly as we possibly can, and it can be found on the Education Scotland PLL webpage. So thank you, everybody. At this point, I would say safe home, enjoy New Orleans, eat loads of shrimp. And Stephen, thank you so much. It's been a great introduction to our system to have you with us today. Thank you.